Let's begin. If you remember last week, what we were discussing, all traits we see in organisms, all biological developments, all living things, everything's a product of this interaction between biological and environmental forces. And this idea that we can break something down into either being caused by the genes or being caused by the environment is a misguided idea. Indeed, it's biology itself that provides the environment its ability to have influences in the first place. And this idea of the environment having effects and ability to have different impacts on different organisms is because of those biological influences. That is, the environment affects different organisms in different ways because of biological differences, which makes it hard to speak about a single environment in the first place. So, a human child, for instance, is going to learn to speak under environmental circumstances that will never cause a cat or a worm to learn how to speak. The environment there is having different effects on different organisms. Bats are going to navigate sounds using that humans can't hear. We don't have the ability to hear it. And bees are going to navigate using light that humans can't see. Environmental temperatures during incubation can affect the sex of alligators, but it doesn't impact the sex of human fetal development. So different environmental influences affect different organisms in different ways, and indeed environments affect organisms at all because of the biological programs that interact with environments to allow these effects to exist. So there really isn't any the environment that's causing things to happen in particular ways any more than there are the genes that are causing environments to develop in certain ways. And such ideas where genes or environments work on this spectrum of causation, where more of one means less of the other, this is caused more by genes and less by environment, or more by environment and less by genes, that's really not how you want to think about causes and effects. That's not how they work. It's wrong. It doesn't matter how many genetically identical organisms you try to raise. If you try to raise one in an environment with no oxygen and the other in an environment with oxygen, you're never going to get the same outputs even though you have the same genetics. The genes aren't causing things to happen any more than the environments are causing them to happen. It's always going to be an interaction between the two. And we also returned to this idea last time that out of all the infinitely possible ways genetic and environmental variables can interact to produce outcomes, only a vanishingly small number of those possible ways are going to end up producing adaptive outcomes. And we sum this up by saying that there are far more ways of being dead than there are of being alive. Out of all the possible biological organisms that might exist, most of them do not live. And the same thing, as we saw, applies to behavior. Out of all the infinite possible ways living things might behave, only a very small subset of those behaviors result in adaptive outcomes, things that improve an organism's ability to reproduce rather than decrease it. And because learning represents a change in behavior in response to environmental inputs, the mechanisms that produce and allow for learning to happen must solve problems, like figuring out what inputs to use and how to modify behavior to rapidly cut down on the infinite possible things it might learn. In other words, to be useful, learning mechanisms need to come preloaded with some assumptions about the world and knowledge of how different problems are structured. And as the adaptive tasks being learned vary a lot in their structure, so too must the learning mechanisms vary in their function. This idea that there's a one general purpose learning mechanism in your brain that's going to solve all the problems an organism might face, this is untenable. It can't be true given how dramatically these learning tasks are going to vary in their structure. The same learning mechanism can't be used to determine which animals in the world are predators.
Welcome back, Jay. Hope you're well.
Or which are otherwise dangerous. And how do you learn language and learn which objects are food and learn which individuals in the world are your relatives and so on. Any general purpose mechanism that would try to learn all these tasks would be too slow to solve any of these problems efficiently and likely incapable of learning any of them at all. In fact, a general purpose mechanism wouldn't even know which tasks are worth learning in the first place. So without knowledge of what to pay attention to in the environment, this learning mechanism might be equally compelled to learn how many blades of grass are in any given patch of dirt as it would be to learn to speak language. It wouldn't know where to direct its learning efforts in the first place, much less how to learn the tasks that it had to learn. And we're going to learn much faster and with much greater efficiency if we use a variety of different learning mechanisms, just like we accomplish more tasks on our phone by using lots of different apps instead of one general purpose app. More learning mechanisms lead to more functionally specific adaptations for learning in particular circumstances, and this gives us more flexibility and more efficiency in our learning, not less. Lots of different learning mechanisms make us better at learning compared to one general learning purpose mechanism. So in sum here, to make learning adaptive, organisms need to know what to learn, and they need to know how to learn it. Learning mechanisms need to function in ways that pick up on available, recurrent features of the environment and use that to modify our knowledge and behavior about the world to efficiently solve specific adaptive problems. And they do so by making lots of assumptions about the world that focus on these regularities and exploit them to create efficient solutions to problems. So we're going to start by returning to our Skinner box learning from last lesson with this adaptive framework in mind. As you might recall, Skinner box, as you see here, relatively plain enclosure that you would put an animal in, usually mice or rats, and you would attempt to reward or punish certain behaviors by providing the animal with a food reward if you're looking to encourage a behavior, so press the lever, get food, or perhaps you would give them an electrical shock if you're trying to dissuade a behavior. You would punish it. So if you want to increase lever pressing behaviors, when they press the lever, you give them a piece of food. If you want to decrease lever pressing behaviors, when they press the lever, you give them an electrical shock to their paws. And you can get them to do things more or less depending on how you provide these rewards and at what time you provide these rewards. And in these Skinner boxes, in this general setup, you can teach animals to do or not do a great variety of things. And you can teach them to do things that aren't just pushing levers. You can teach them to play basketball if you want. And you can also use the Skinner box to uncover a lot of things about how different species learn, because in this case the environment is so nicely controlled, there aren't many variables. And that's great. But it's also clear that Skinner boxes are not great mechanisms for uncovering a lot of other information about learning. And this is because the environment of these Skinner boxes, it really doesn't resemble the natural world much at all. There's a variety of naturally developing competencies that these boxes are simply never going to uncover, and a variety of learning tasks that aren't learned through receiving this constant stream of rewards or punishments. In fact, given this relatively meager setup here of the Skinner boxes, experiments using them can really only find evidence of very particular types of learning mechanisms. It's going to be blind to a lot of learning that occurs in natural environments because these don't resemble natural environments in many important regards. Doesn't allow you to see a lot of things. So what we're going to do here today is we're going to turn to some empirical examples of learning to help demonstrate this point. Some of these examples we're going to see from the research literature do involve Skinner box type setups, where you attempt to teach animals associations between a stimulus, a behavior, and an outcome. And then we're going to move on to other examples of learning that are far different than Skinner boxes. So we're going to start this examination of learning by thinking about the adaptive problems of figuring out what things in your environment to eat. There are a great many things out there in the world you might think about eating, Organism could ingest soil, could ingest rocks, tree bark, animal dungs, leaves of a particular tree, could eat your own offspring, could eat eggs, offspring of other species, could eat other animals, you could eat decaying trees, bones, and so on. Lots of things organisms could put in their mouth. But only a very small number of those possible things that the organism might eat is going to prove to be adequately nutritious. Some may prove toxic, even to the point of being fatal. Some things you might eat can keep you alive, but they're not things you want to eat if you can avoid them. And so there's a learning problem here. So in order to solve this problem of acquiring and ingesting the proper food sources, we should expect species to come prepared to seek out or avoid certain types of food. That is, they're going to be prepared to eat things or not eat things, even if they have no previous experience eating them before. They don't need learning trials to figure out what to avoid to eat, because if they did need these learning trials, they'd probably starve and die. You might see animals eat familiar foods when possible, instead of novel foods. And they might eat smaller amounts of novel foods during the first time they're eating them, because these foods might contain toxic compounds, and you don't want to ingest too much of those if you're not sure. And when required, animals should also learn to modify their future behavior to avoid sources of food they have previously eaten. Indeed, the greater number of foods that a species tends to eat, the greater the need for this learning might be, because each possible new source of food that you ingest represents potential risks that it carries toxic compounds or isn't adequately nutritious. The more different foods an organism eats, the more sensitive it needs to be about learning about what to eat. And there's a term for this kind of learning when it comes to avoiding certain foods, called conditioned taste aversion. And this is where an animal is going to learn an association between a taste, or sometimes even just a smell, of a particular type of food, and a later sickness. So if an animal ingests a specific type of food, and later it becomes sick, it'll tend to avoid that food in the future. And it's not uncommon for us just to come across a person in our own life, this person might be you, that loathes, just hates a particular type of food. They can't be around it, they can't eat it, they can't smell it, and sometimes this is so extreme, they get nauseous and vomit after eating it, or even just smelling it or seeing it. Now, from an adaptationist perspective, this reaction can make a lot of sense. If there are harmful organisms living in the food, like bacteria or molds, or toxic compounds that are present in this food, ingesting it can cause bodily harm, it can cause infections, and it might even prove lethal if you eat too much of it. So preferentially, avoiding these foods that carry cues associated with the presence of these harmful agents, like visual signs of spoilage, tastes that are associated with certain chemical compounds. These are the types of cues that could prove adaptive to pay attention to. And so we likely have some cognitive mechanisms that'll generate negative emotional states to their presence, like disgust. So you'll feel unpleasant in this proximate sense, in this immediate sense. It doesn't feel good to feel disgusted. It doesn't feel good to throw up. But just because it doesn't feel good, that doesn't mean these bad feelings aren't useful for us. These aversions are actually rather useful in channeling our behavior away from harmful courses of action. You don't want to eat the toxic food. You don't want to eat the spoiled food. And yeah, it feels bad, but you do something useful because of that bad feeling. And similarly, the responses of vomiting and nausea begin to make a lot more sense. If harmful compounds are detected to have been ingested by your body, one great line of defense is to remove the contents of your stomach to avoid any more of them getting absorbed into your system. If you've eaten something that's toxic and you vomit out what you have eaten, you're going to remove a lot of toxic compounds from your body. And there are, of course, consequences to nausea and vomiting, including damage to the esophagus from regurgitating stomach acid, failing to absorb whatever viable nutrients were in the meal that you're
No
getting rid of.
refunds!
But these downsides are usually more than offset by this whole not poisoning yourself thing. The conditioned taste aversion is very useful. However, in order to learn this association between taste and sickness, a learning mechanism needs to come prepared with a lot of assumptions about the world and solutions to specific problems. So specifically, this learning mechanism needs to know that gastrointestinal distress is associated with specific feeding behaviors that might have occurred hours or minutes prior. And learning to avoid tastes in this case really doesn't resemble learning associations between the immediate behaviors and immediate rewards that you tend to see in Skinner boxes. So in these rat boxes, these Skinner boxes, the rat presses the lever, and there's usually a food reward that immediately follows that behavior. And the longer you delay giving the rat the reward after they press the lever, the worse the rats tend to learn this association. So if a rat presses a lever, it gets a food pellet immediately, it learns a lot better to press the lever than if it presses the lever and gets a food reward in 5 minutes. Further complicating matters, even if the animal knows that eating itself is related to this feeling of sickness, sometimes animals eat more than one food during a given bout of feeding. So you might have dinner, you might eat chicken and rice and broccoli in a single meal. And if you get sick later, the learning mechanism needs to learn to pair that sickness with the correct food that made you sick and not necessarily every food that you've eaten. Learning this is really a tricky proposition. And as such, we should probably expect that many animals come prepared to learn these associations between food and negative outcomes only under certain specific conditions. And this is exactly what has been discovered. In a research paper by two researchers, Garcia and Coley, they report that they took rats, put them in a cage, like these Skinner boxes, and they gave them access to flavored water with a drinking spout, and this spout would measure how much the rats drank, how often they licked it, things like that. Then what they do is, for some of the rats, the researchers hooked this drinking spout up to a device that would flash a light and make a noise when they licked it. And so now we have two groups of rats here. We have one group of rats that has what we would call tasty water. It's flavored water. And another rat that has access to what you are going to call bright and noisy water, because every time they drink from it, there's a flash of light and a little click. There's a sound. So tasty water and bright, noisy water. And so with these two groups, they would do either one of two things. Either the rat would be made nauseous after drinking from the spout, and they did this in a couple of ways, one of which was just exposing the rats to x-rays, tends to make them nauseous, or they would have their paws electrically shocked after drinking from the spouts. So to be clear, this is not very kind to the rats. You're shocking them or poisoning them, basically. But it did reveal something rather interesting about how these rats learn. When you make the rats nauseous after they drink, they would subsequently avoid the flavor of the water, but they would not learn to avoid water spouts that were bright and noisy. Nausea did not teach the rats to avoid lights and sounds, but it did teach them to avoid taste. By contrast, if you shock the rats, you get the opposite pattern. So if licking the spout gave the rat a shock, and it was associated, in this case, with lights and sounds, the rats would learn to avoid drinking spouts that gave off light and sound. But if you shocked the rats after drinking from a flavored bit of water, they would not avoid the taste. They would not avoid flavored water that had been paired with shock. And this pattern of selective learning really would not be possible if the rats were using the same learning mechanism for both problems. It seems instead that there are multiple different learning mechanisms being used, each of which are making different assumptions about causes and effects. So that is, one part of the rat's brain here seems prepared to learn that immediate pain is associated with audio and visual cues. So you might detect a predator with eyes and ears, more so than your tongue. And then you have another part of the brain that knows that sickness is associated with taste cues, because you do detect toxins with your tongue, but not always with your eyes or your ears. So because of this, the same stimulus can have radically different learning outcomes depending on the domain of the thing being learned. These learning outcomes require different inputs to generate different outputs. And we can dig deeper into this idea with more rat learning experiments. And as it turns out, if you want to find out how specific these learning mechanisms can be, even tasks that might seem very similar to one another on a surface level can still utilize different mechanisms for learning and different decision rules for generating behavior. So sticking to the topic of things you might ingest, things you might eat, drink. There's an adaptive problem here that all animals face, which we discussed, which is finding food and water. What do I put into my body? However, it seems that this isn't just one adaptive problem. This is at least two here. There's the problem of finding food, and there's the problem of finding water. And we know this from experiments looking at rat learning in what's called a T maze, which is what you can see here. As the name suggests, this maze is a rather simple one, shaped like a capital letter T. The rat walks down one hallway, and at the end of this hallway, there's a door to the left, and there's a door to the right. And once they go through a door, they can't go back out. These are one-way doors. So they're trying to see if they can get rats to run these mazes successfully. And the experimental group in this case, you either have rats that are hungry because they've been relatively food deprived, so they're motivated to find food, or rats that are thirsty because they were relatively water deprived, so they're motivated to find water. So in this maze, the researchers were either giving the reward of food for hungry rats or water for thirsty ones. And the goal here is to get the rat to run the maze to find the resource it's after. So do you go left or do you go right to get the reward you're looking for? And the experimenters here were trying to teach the rats a very simple decision rule. And it's this: go the opposite direction you went last time. So the first time the rats run this maze, there's food or water on both sides. They always get a reward no matter which door they pick. On each of the following trials, the reward is only placed where they didn't go last time. So if the rat went right on the first trial, food would be on the left next time. And if they went left, the food would be on the right. And it didn't matter if they got this right or wrong. So if you went right and there was food there, food is on the left. If you went right and there wasn't food there, food is still on the left. All the rats have to do in this case is learn to go in the opposite direction from the last direction they went. If you go right last time, go left now. If you went left last time, go right now. Hungry rats were really good at learning this. They were able to learn go the opposite direction I went last time. They were so good, in fact, that basically every rat they tested learned it, and this learning occurred fairly rapidly. It took about 5 to 10 days before the rats really learned this rule. By contrast, almost none of the thirsty rats learned this rule. Only 3 of the 10 they tested learned it, and this experiment went on for 15 days before they stopped it. Most rats never actually reached the performance level of learning it. And it took longer for them to reach that spot where they learned it even at all. So why might this be? The rats are all motivated here. They're all facing a very similar task. The task is not that complicated. Why are they learning so differently? Is it the case that maybe thirsty rats are just dumber than hungry rats? Probably not. And in this case, to understand the finding that we're seeing helps to think about the adaptive problems of finding food and finding water in a natural environment that the rats might inhabit. If there are any recurrent statistical regularities about the world that the rats could use to solve one of these problems more efficiently, evolution can favor mechanisms that operate as if they know something about the world like that. So what we're thinking about then is how food and water tends to be distributed in the world. And there are definitely some statistical regularities worth paying attention to. Specifically, bodies of water don't tend to move around very much. Bodies of water do not vary in their location as much as food does. Lakes, rivers, streams, these don't tend to get up and walk around the environment. They're stable locations, minus occasionally drying up. So if you found a lake one day, the lake is probably there tomorrow. By contrast, food moves around the world quite a bit. If you're talking about plant food, like let's say berries, the berries that you eat today might not be there tomorrow, whether because you ate them all or because something else ate the rest of them. If you're talking about prey, that's even more true, because you're not necessarily going to kill animals in the same location of the world every time. Prey moves around the world physically, and so you could expect the same of a lot of other food rewards. It seems that evolution is favoring cognitive mechanisms that are making different assumptions about the locations of food and water. And indeed, similar results to these were found by another researcher, Timberlake, in a 1983 paper. He was trying to teach hungry or thirsty rats that to get food or water, they had to contact a moving object. So he'd release a ball bearing into the cage, and when the rats touched the ball bearing, or in some way interacted with it, they would receive food or water elsewhere. And he was far better at teaching these rats to interact with the moving object when they were getting food, rather than when they were getting water, which is perhaps due to some mechanisms related to hunger, cueing cognitive systems that are searching the environment for certain particular stimuli, like movement. Because if I'm hungry, I'm looking for prey. Prey is moving around the environment, my visual system might attend to that more. If I'm thirsty, this cue really doesn't work quite as well because water is not moving around the world. And speaking of food and conditioned taste aversions, let's turn to another example here outside the Skinner box and look at a food-related learning phenomenon that happens in humans, which is called pregnancy sickness. Pregnancy sickness is a collection of food-related symptoms, typically occurs in women in the first trimester, and these include avoiding certain foods, becoming nauseous in their presence, and sometimes vomiting after eating them. We could consider this pregnancy sickness a type of learning because we're seeing changes in behavior, in this case eating behavior and food preferences, that result from experiences of eating and smelling food, followed by nausea, quite similar to our rats that we saw before. And what's really interesting about this pregnancy sickness is that it often hits women with familiar foods as well. That is, these are foods that women previously ate, previously enjoyed, things that were once pleasant, and are now taking on a distinctly negative, unpleasant tone. And unlike the rats, this is happening in the absence of any external cues. So these women aren't being made sick because they're getting x-rayed, they're being made sick because of things happening in their body. And of course, this pregnancy sickness, these negative feelings, result in women eating different foods and sometimes risking inadequate nutrition in case the nausea gets too intense or too frequent. Many people would just assume that that's a byproduct of being pregnant. Your hormones are weird and this is messing with your brain and now you're not eating properly. And because of that, what we're going to do is we're going to give you some medication to treat nausea, because no one enjoys being nauseous. And these foods that they're eating aren't toxic, right? Because I've eaten these before. I've enjoyed these before. Even the name of this phenomenon makes you feel like it's something you should treat. Pregnancy sickness. Sickness implies this is probably not very good for the body. However, treating the pregnancy sickness may not always be the best idea if pregnancy sickness is serving some adaptive function. And what function might that serve? Well, if we think back to our discussion here about food aversions and what not to eat, we noted that many sources of food contain toxic compounds that can harm the body, and these can often be detected via sensory routes of taste and smell. And one perspective on pregnancy sickness, originally developed by researcher Margie Profit, suggests that pregnancy sickness is a mechanism that operates to protect the developing embryo rather than the mother. Specifically, many foods we eat contain chemical compounds that are called teratogens. These are substances that can cause birth defects. And while those compounds might be tolerable and managed by an adult body that's capable of producing all sorts of chemical defenses to neutralize them, the developing embryo is not as prepared to handle these compounds, and it could be more susceptible to damage from these environmental toxins. And doses that may not in any way be toxic to the mother can actually be toxic to the embryo. So as such, it was hypothesized that pregnancy sickness may function to lower a mother's tolerance for these teratogenic compounds to avoid negatively impacting embryonic development, and operate selectively to avoid certain foods during key windows of development where those compounds would be the most harmful. Pregnancy sickness, thus, may function more as a dietary recalibration mechanism for embryonic needs. And indeed, it's been well documented that ingesting higher levels of these teratogens in pregnant mammals, including humans, can result in higher rates of birth defects, and avoiding them as much as possible seems a prudent adaptive strategy if you want to raise offspring that are healthy. So perhaps it's no coincidence then that pregnancy sickness tends to coincide with the time that embryonic development is maximally vulnerable to these toxins. In humans, this period tends to be from about day 20 to day 65 of pregnancy. This is when the limbs and organs of the developing fetus begin to form and differentiate during their development. And this is also the time when the placenta forms, which is allowing the developing embryo direct access to the mother's bloodstream, and thus letting compounds that are in the mother's bloodstream enter into the embryo. And so as such, it may come as no surprise here that pregnancy sickness tends to begin about 2 to 4 weeks following conception. It peaks at about 6 to 8 weeks, and then declines afterwards until it usually completely disappears around week 14 of pregnancy. And it's also something that happens very regularly in humans. About 75-90% of women tend to report nausea in their first trimester of pregnancy. Over half of them report vomiting as a result of this nausea. And we can also consult the cross-cultural record here as well, where you're looking at what happens in different societies across the world. And this cross-cultural record tells us that a sudden aversion to food is recognized across the world as being an early sign of pregnancy in women. Before women necessarily even know they're pregnant, they might start avoiding certain foods and getting sick by them, and this might be what cues them into the fact that they are actually pregnant. So at the time when the developing embryo is most susceptible to these toxic compounds, this is when it appears that maternal tastes change, and then after this critical window has passed, her tastes change back again. And this may well function to try and balance out the risks of toxins affecting the embryonic development against the nutritional needs of the mother and the offspring. The mother needs to eat. She needs to get adequate nutrition for herself and for the baby, but she also has to balance that against eating things that might be toxic for the baby, though not necessarily for her. And what's really fascinating about the learning that takes place during early pregnancy is that it's entirely endogenous, which means it occurs entirely from factors within the mother's body rather than from any external source. So the mothers aren't learning to avoid foods from any type of external reinforcement or punishment. Women are learning about what foods to avoid from internal cues. And this is a great example of the body needing to know what to learn and how to learn it. And how learning in these natural environments may not resemble what we see in the Skinner boxes. Pregnancy sickness in this case may well represent a biologically prepared learning mechanism, one that turns on in the face of pregnancy and then turns off again when it's no longer required. And it also represents a great example concerning the importance of this adaptationist approach to psychology, using evolutionary theory to inform our understanding. Because if this is true, that pregnancy sickness did evolve with the function of protecting and developing the embryo, but this function was unknown or underappreciated. This could lead to the mother or a doctor treating the symptoms of pregnancy sickness to reduce or eliminate it. In doing so, they'll probably make the mother's immediate life feel more pleasant because she's not nauseous anymore, but there could be major consequences to the pregnancy because of this, including an increase in fetal birth defects or even fetal death. Indeed, something like this has actually happened before. This isn't some hypothetical example. Some of you might be familiar with a drug by the name of thalidomide, which was used by doctors to treat morning sickness. And this resulted in a massive spike of birth defects and fetal death. And this is likely due both to the chemical properties of the drug being taken and the lowering of the maternal defense mechanisms against foodborne toxins. And so this is the point we're going to return to in future lessons in thinking about infectious disease and immune responses, which is that treating the symptoms of an infection is not always the best idea, because sometimes those symptoms represent bodily defense mechanisms, and if you treat them and reduce them, you can actually make infections worse. But returning to pregnancy sickness, women who experience severe pregnancy sickness naturally also tended to show lower rates of spontaneous abortion than women with mild or no pregnancy sickness. So if you're really sick, you're really nauseous during pregnancy, this actually tended to have good outcomes for your pregnancy. In one such study, looking at about 900 women, those who experienced pregnancy sickness to the extent that it made them nauseous and vomit, they were reporting spontaneous abortion rates, fetal death, of about 1% by the 20th week of their pregnancy. In women who just experienced nausea but no vomiting, that went from 1% to 3.6%. And in those that experienced no nausea and no vomiting, that went up to 7.2%. And patterns of results like this have been replicated in a couple other large samples as well, both for rates of spontaneous abortion and rates of birth defects, suggesting that there's this function of pregnancy sickness in actually protecting fetal development. And to finish our discussion on pregnancy sickness with one final note, it's worth paying attention to, again, this cross-cultural record that notes many pre-industrial societies, forager, hunter-gatherer societies, pre-industrial societies. Women sometimes consciously, intentionally attempt to terminate a pregnancy. And when they do so, this is often accomplished by ingesting poisonous plant compounds. Boiled grass, tree barks, things of that nature. This connection between what we eat and a successful pregnancy appears to have been picked up on by an evolutionary process, however consciously or unconsciously the connection has been made. Very interesting example of learning. But let's shift gears again to another example of learning that's going to break us out of the Skinner box, which is language. The ability to produce and understand language carries great possible adaptive benefits. It allows information to be placed inside the minds of other people without any need for direct experience or independent generation. Given that the value of information about the world is so high, it's why we learn about things at all in the first place, this ability to obtain, learn, and share information at such low cost could prove invaluable to people. That is, you can get information from other members of your species that entailed years of experience or great risk to obtain, and you don't have to pay any of those costs. You could also take information and place it inside the mind of your own children, which helps them navigate unfamiliar scenarios successfully before they're involved in them, and greatly enhance their survival by avoiding mistakes that could range from minor to fatal. There's really a lot of value in not needing to literally reinvent the wheel to gain the benefits of using the wheel. It's not difficult to see the possible adaptive benefits of language. And further, children in all human societies across time that we're aware of learn language provided they're around other people who are speaking it. Even though a more appropriate term not really is speaking it, but producing it. Since even deaf children can manage to acquire language using gestures rather than speech. And this learning happens in children often without any formal instruction or rewards. It happens early in the child's life, with children sometimes as young as 3 years old understanding and speaking in grammatically correct sentences. And as far as I know, we're the only species that does this. So no matter how much you might speak to other species, try and explicitly teach them language, they never come to understand it, much less produce it to the extent that humans do. Sure, sometimes you can get animals to respond to some pretty basic verbal commands after extensive training periods. You can get them to sit up, lay down, roll over, if you spend enough time explicitly teaching them and rewarding them for every time they get closer to this behavior, just like a Skinner box. But you can also teach animals to do this exact same stuff with non-language sounds, like the sound of a bell or a gesture. It doesn't have to be language. You can teach animals to behave for lots of different cues. And so this suggests maybe animals aren't exactly learning language so much as they're learning responses to particular sounds. Not quite the same thing. Why only humans learn language is an interesting question in its own right. But I'm not going to try and answer why that's the case now. It's enough to note for our present purposes that whatever learning mechanisms humans have that acquire language, they're not shared with other species. And we also have all these physiological adaptations for producing speech as well, in the vocal tract. Our throats, we have a lot of different pieces in there that coordinate with different parts of our body to produce speech. While we also attempt to manage a couple other competing problems. If you're talking, this radically increases the probability you're going to choke on food, because food can now enter the wrong part of the body it's not supposed to get into. And so we have a lot of adaptations for managing the ability to talk without dying. And all of this information that we just reviewed and more suggests that the human capacity for learning language is very much an adaptation. And the presence of these physiological organs, our vocal tract and our throat, and these complex behaviors implies a corresponding complexity in the psychological systems we have that acquire this language. So there's one real interesting aspect here of learning language that we need to appreciate before we move on, which is that while children do learn language from others, children are not instructed on the rules of language. In other words, the thing children are receiving from other people when it comes to learning language is the output only. What children hear are sentences. What they do not hear are the rules that govern the creation of these sentences. Children do not get taught what qualifies as a grammatically correct sentence. All they hear are sentences. But despite the poverty of inputs that children are getting, they're still able to abstract meaning from these sentences and abstract the rules governing them and apply those to novel sentences they haven't heard before. Intuitively, anyway. Indeed, I don't think any of us could even make the rules of grammar that we obey when we speak explicit. We just hear sentences or produce them, and they sound correct or they don't sound correct. The rules that are governing what counts as a correct or incorrect sentence are operating well below the level of conscious awareness. And it takes a long period of explicit study if you want to actually understand the rules of grammar. Nevertheless, we're all experts on it. That is, if you're an English speaker, like me, and you heard the phrase, "I saw a big dog," you would understand that it refers to a specific dog which is large. And you would say that sentence is grammatically correct. But if you heard the sentence, "I saw big he," you wouldn't exactly know why that's wrong, but you would know that that's wrong. I saw the big dog, that makes sense. I saw the big he, that doesn't make sense at all. And children as young as 1 or 2 years old understand this distinction well, without it ever being taught to them. Similarly, children make some mistakes of generalization in language more than others. So children might eventually refer to feet as foots. That is, they're overgeneralizing the suffix s. Usually you add an s to the end of something to pluralize it, but some specific words, you don't do that, and children will make some incorrect generalizations there. But they make other generalization mistakes a lot less often. So children tend to not as regularly make the mistake of overgeneralizing the ing suffix. So children will rarely say something like, I liking mommy. They're not going to produce that sentence. Whereas they might say, I have 2 foots, rather than I have 2 feet. And the probable reason here that children can understand and construct these novel sentences from what they hear alone, and why they're making some grammatical mistakes more than others, is because they come prepared with a capacity to learn language using predefined rules. And while the content of one language to another is going to differ in terms of what sounds or words correspond to what meanings, like English uses a different word for dog than Chinese does, or a different word than Spanish uses, the underlying learning mechanisms in these children's brains all seems to be roughly the same. The children are recreating language as if they're filling in the blanks for an existing rule set. They have what you would consider a universal grammar present in their minds. So while explaining the full scope of our language acquisition mechanisms is well beyond my capacities here, there's one extremely interesting finding about the learning of language I wanted to highlight today. And this example concerns what's called a pigeon. Not a bird, a pigeon. Spelled P-I-D-G-I-N. Which, by the way, this is another very interesting facet of language. Children can learn that the same sounding word has 2 different meanings. But we're going to skip over that for now. It's just interesting. Sometimes there are 2 or more different ethnic groups which lack a shared language, but they come into recurrent contact with each other. Usually related to reasons like relocation or trade. So for instance, in the past, you might have slaves from several geographical regions that have all been brought into one area, and they have to work together in the same area. Because these groups lack a shared language, they form a rudimentary shared language. And that's what a pigeon is. A pigeon are these simplified communication systems. They're not really complete languages, and no member of these groups speak the pigeon as any type of native language. The pigeons tend to have limited vocabularies. Words are expressed in very minimal units. They have basic grammar, if they have grammar at all, simple syllables. They vary in the word order of sentences. They're often spoken differently by each speaker of the pigeon. And they have a lot of features that help cut down on the complexity of communicating. So you can use the pigeon to express basic ideas, and they can work well enough to get these groups to coordinate and complete a task, but it's not a perfect solution to the language problem. So an example of a pigeon sentence, this one comes from Hawaii, could be reported as this: the poor people all potato eat, which means all the poor people ate were potatoes. Here's another example of a pigeon sentence I came across. Sometimes good road get, sometime. All same bend get, angle get, no. Any kind same, all same human life, all same. Which sounds like gibberish, but once you're actually understanding what the pigeon means, what they're trying to express here is something along the lines of sometimes there's a good road, sometimes there's a bad road, with bends and corners, right? Everything's like that. Human life is like that. That's what they're trying to express. These pigeons are not the most elegant communication systems, but they're like a 30% solution to the problem of communicating. And these pigeons rarely advance much among the adult members of any of these groups that are speaking them. The adults use them as a rudimentary secondary system of communication, and they sometimes will do this for decades. However, here's the interesting part. If children from these communities are all raised around this pigeon communication system, the children do not end up speaking the pigeon. Instead, what actually happens here is the younger generation morphs that pigeon into a complete language, which is called a Creole. The Creole is not the same language as the pigeon, and it's not the same language as any of the adult groups, and it doesn't necessarily borrow from any of the adult groups. It becomes its own fully formed language that the children speak as their own native tongue. They speak it fluently as if they had been a natural speaker of Spanish their whole life, exactly the same thing. While Creoles may be simpler than many other languages, they share a great many similarities with them, and the Creoles that you've seen form across the world also share a great similarity with each other. They display a basic language structure that the pigeons lack, and so you get to express ideas far more coherently. So an example in pigeon might sound like this: building, high place, wall part, time, and then now temperature every time give you. Confusing, I know. We can express this idea in Creole now, and it would sound something like this. Get one electric sign high up on the wall of the building, show you what time and temperature get right now. And if you account for some local expressions and translation issues here, the Creole much more elegantly expresses that there's an electric sign on top of a building that tells you what the current time and temperature is. But it has a structure, it has a grammar that the pigeon lacks. And what's really fascinating about this example is that it helps demonstrate just how prepared children are to learn language. Their knowledge of what to learn and how to learn is so biologically prepared for them that they're even capable of creating their own language when necessity demands it from the impoverished cues they're receiving. It also helps refine our understanding of learning a little bit as well. Because when it comes to learning information, this isn't so much a direct transmission from one brain to another the way you might physically transmit a virus from one person to another. But rather that learning represents a recreation of information inside of our brains. It's not that information goes from one brain to the next. It's that information leaves one body and is then recreated inside the body of the other, based on what inputs it receives. A general purpose learning mechanism would be completely incapable of this task. A general purpose learning mechanism is not going to take a pigeon and turn it into a language. It needs rules on how to do that. You can see some examples here, by the way, if you want to read these. But another part about what's so interesting of these pigeons and Creoles is that it's the children that are speaking the Creole as their native language. And this isn't necessarily something that you might expect. For instance, you might ask, why don't children just speak the language of one of their parents as their native tongue, rather than the Creole? Why don't the children also use the pigeon? Perhaps children that were raised about multiple groups would instead learn multiple different languages rather than the Creole. You might also ask questions, well, why are the children learning this as a native tongue? Why are they forming a new language with this? Whereas the parents do not. The parents do not learn the Creole. The parents do not create the Creole. And this will happen despite the fact that the parents have been speaking the pigeon for longer than the children have been alive. Indeed, it's rather interesting that in these communities, parents often try to maintain their ancestral tongue. they try and get their children to speak their native language, and they do so with less success than the parents might prefer. That is, the children seem to be motivated to learn the Creole and not as motivated to learn the parents' native language. There are lots of implications for this finding as well, and we're going to get to those in later lectures when we talk about parenting. But for now, it's enough to get you thinking about these questions. Like, why are adults not learning the Creole? Are the children and adults using the same language learning mechanisms here? What cues are the children picking up on when it comes to these learning tasks? And why are they failing to learn some things, like perhaps the parent's native tongue, while successfully learning the Creole more? These are just questions to let you bounce around your brain more. In continuing on with our examination of these different learning mechanisms, I want to return to an example we talked about last class concerning cats and mice. Cats, being predators, mice being their prey, create situations where frequent learning trials aren't offered. Any mice that were trying to use a content-free general-purpose learning mechanism that had to take a lot of time to learn to be afraid of a cat only after it associated cats with some negative experience would probably not end up being very reproductively successful, because the mice are going to end up as a meal. The cats present immediate danger to the mice, and so we probably should expect the mice to come with some mechanisms prepared to learn this fear of cats with a very great ease. Mice that take too much time to learn to be afraid of cats end up getting eaten. Same logic should extend out to a great many species. They should come prepared to readily learn fears of cues associated with certain dangerous stimuli that were recurrent in past environments. However, when the environmental stimuli weren't dangerous or recurring parts of a past environment, species should probably have a pretty hard time learning to fear them. To put this in a simple example, a lot of us have experienced burning ourselves on a stove. But despite that negative direct experience, very few of us will ever learn a real fear of stoves. A respect, perhaps, but not a fear. You don't see people crying and screaming and running away from stoves because they burned themselves on it once. This type of fear learning isn't biologically prepared because stoves weren't part of our ancestral environment as a repeat feature of things we encounter. Conversely, though, even people who have never been bitten by a spider may come to be afraid of spiders. In fact, I was kind of wary of putting this slide up in the first place because I know spiders can freak people out. And people can get freaked out by spiders even if they don't have any direct negative experience with them. May never have been bitten by a spider, may have never been harmed by a spider, still deathly afraid of it. And this could be because spiders, hypothetically, may have represented a source of danger worth attending to in our past environments. And also, very interestingly, when people develop a fear of spiders, they tend to develop a fear of all spiders, rather than just the most dangerous spiders. And this makes a lot of sense, as, say, mice may learn to be afraid of all cats, and not just one particular cat, because you don't want to have to manually test every single animal you see to find out, is this dangerous? If you find out that one spider is dangerous, it might be good to apply that learning broadly and avoid spiders in general, so that you don't have to get bit by the dangerous ones. And in fact, people extend this out further to avoid things that are spider-like. So when Halloween comes around, I often have a great time chasing Vessel around Spirit of Halloween with a fake spider. She's afraid of spiders a little bit. And even though she knows that this is a fake toy spider, because it resembles a spider, it still makes her skin crawl. It still freaks her out a little bit. So in order to generate adaptive behaviors, these learning mechanisms should, again, frequently be expected to know what to learn and how to learn it, and use different cues in different domains to develop appropriate adaptive biological responses. We should not be expected to acquire fear as readily for all things. And the specificity of these fear learning mechanisms. These were tested some time ago by two researchers. I believe, if I'm pronouncing this right, it's Cook and McKenna, 1989. And they were examining some lab-reared monkeys. Monkeys that have been raised in a laboratory setting. And because these lab-reared monkeys, they were born in a lab, they've never been out in the wild, because they didn't have much experience with any common fear-relevant stimuli, they often didn't show any initial fear responses to things. So if you showed these monkeys a fake flower, they're not afraid of the flower. If you showed these monkeys a toy snake, they're not afraid of the toy snake. Now, because snake bites are dangerous, and they're hard to control experimentally, and flowers are relatively harmless, it can be difficult to give monkeys any direct, experimentally controlled, negative experiences with this. That is, you don't want to have lab-reared monkeys and put real snakes in there and have real snakes bite them. That's not something that you really want to do if you can avoid it. And similarly, you can't put a flower in a monkey cage and get the flower to bite the monkey because flowers don't hurt them. But you still want to see if you can get these monkeys to develop a fear response based upon some negative experience. And there is something we can rely upon there, which is that monkeys are social creatures that learn from each other. And because monkeys are quite a bit like humans, we're very closely evolutionary related, monkeys actually enjoy watching videos too. So what the researchers did in this case is they set up a scenario where lab-reared monkeys would see an object, in this case either a toy snake or a toy flower, at the same time as a video of other monkeys that were either behaving fearfully or calmly towards what they were seeing. So in this case, slider goes up, the lab-reared monkey sees a flower and a video of another wild monkey behaving fearfully towards that flower. Or, thing goes up, sees a flower, the other monkey is behaving calmly. Same thing with a toy snake, fearfully or calmly towards a snake or a flower. And when they did this, they found that the lab-reared monkeys would readily develop a fear of the snake. All they had to do was see other monkeys be afraid of the snake. And then they would start showing fearful and avoidant behaviors themselves towards this toy snake. But the same fear would not develop if you showed them a flower. No matter how many times the monkeys saw other monkeys being afraid of a flower, they would not behave fearfully towards it or avoid it. So while it seems required for some environmental stimuli to be present for the monkeys to learn, in this case the monkeys to learn to be afraid of this needed to see other monkeys be afraid of it, that same stimulus doesn't teach the monkeys to be afraid of everything equally. Their fear learning mechanisms were primed to respond to certain fear-relevant stimuli and not to others. Now, it's possible that this research just resulted because flowers are plants, snakes are animals, maybe the monkeys are just prepared to be afraid of animals, right? So they tried this again, and this time they used 3 different objects. They used a fake crocodile, a toy rabbit, or some other neutral third object, like a block. Again, wall goes up, they see another monkey behaving fearfully towards this object that they previously weren't afraid of, and then how does the monkey in the lab behave afterwards? And again, they found monkeys without any prior fear towards these objects would quickly develop a fear towards crocodiles, but not towards rabbits or other neutral third objects. You couldn't get the monkeys to be afraid of toy rabbits. You could teach them to be afraid of toy crocodiles and toy snakes. And experiments like these speak to the matter we discussed prior, which that there is no single the environment out there. The same environmental stimuli, in this case, watching other members of your species be afraid of things, these can provoke far different responses depending on what the biology of the organism allows. That is, in order to learn to be afraid from other members of your species, you need special mechanisms that attend to this. And these special mechanisms, it seems, don't become fearful to anything. They become fearful to very specific things. Need to know what to learn and how to learn it. There's one final piece I want to talk about today when it comes to learning that concerns another tricky adaptive problem that a lot of sexually reproducing species face, which is incest avoidance. Many species reproduce sexually, where the genes from two parents combined to form a new organism. Now, why species reproduce sexually as opposed to asexually? Why don't we all just produce identical copies of themselves? This is an interesting question. We can tackle that more fully later. But for now, it's enough for us to note that in species that do sexually reproduce, there's a well-documented phenomenon, which you may have heard of, called inbreeding depression. This refers to the fact that when closely related members of a species, like a brother and a sister, or parent and offspring, when they reproduce with each other, that tends to be associated with a variety of poor outcomes that arise for the offspring. And in the interests of producing viable offspring that are going to be healthy and productive and go on to reproduce themselves, it's usually in the best interests of the species to select mates who are not close genetic relatives. And in humans, this is often achieved by utilizing a sense of disgust or avoidance when it comes to thoughts or behaviors of having sex with close relatives. So if I told you, close your eyes and imagine deeply, passionately, and sensually kissing your mother, a lot of people are going to conjure up feelings of, that's gross, that's disgusting, why would you want to do that? And they'll never go out and pursue it themselves. These are very useful disgust reactions to avoid the negative implications that come with inbreeding depression. But before these disgust reactions can be useful, there is a learning task we have to solve first. That is, we need to learn who are our close relatives. This is a real adaptive problem. How do organisms estimate degree of genetic relatedness to each other? So like our previous examples of learning, because this learning challenge is posing its own set of problems, this type of learning is also going to require particular cues that are organized before they can be useful. We need to come prepared with mechanisms that avoid incestuous relationships and with mechanisms that are functioning to estimate degrees of genetic relatedness in the first place. And how you estimate genetic relatedness, this is a problem that's going to require different inputs, different information processing mechanisms than, say, solving the problem of finding food or finding water, or learning language or avoiding predators. These problems are very different. They require different cues and they require different behavioral rules. The cues that signal something is a good food, these aren't going to be useful to you in learning who is going to make a good mate. The qualities of good food and good mating are not the same, and so we need different mechanisms for them. So we might expect that we have some specialized cognitive mechanisms for estimating our genetic relatedness to others, and then using that information to acquire a sexual disgust or aversion towards those deemed too closely related. So while you might think there's an easy solution to this problem, of course, which is just have parents tell their children who their brothers and sisters are, who their cousins are, that's probably not the way we solve these problems. At least, it's not the only way we're going to solve these problems. And that's because, as we mentioned earlier, humans are the only species I'm aware of that have a complex language and communicate this way. Yet, despite lacking this language, every sexually reproducing species appears to solve this problem of inbreeding in some capacity. And humans as a species ourselves also were probably already solving these incest avoidance problems before we were speaking. So we want to think about what cues could we use to estimate genetic relatedness? What beyond language could we use? And in this respect, there's one ancestrally recurrent cue that appears to be relevant, at least for humans, which is co-residency during childhood. That is, the more time you've spent around specific individuals when you're young, the more probable those individuals are close genetic relationships to you. By contrast, as you get older, as you start to move around the world on your own, and as you make new associations with new people socially, as you get older, the time you spend around people loses its value as a cue to genetic relatedness. So put in some mundane terms here, in humans, closely related individuals, your immediate family, they tend to spend more time around you when you're very young than do non-relatives. And as you get older, this changes. So this means we might have a useful cue for estimating degree of relatedness that a learning mechanism can pick up on. And it seems that's exactly what we do. Some of the best evidence for this comes from what are called Israeli kibbutz. The kibbutz were founded as agricultural communities based around some socialist utopian ideas, as far as I've been able to understand. But for our purpose, what's important to know here is how they raised their children. In these communities, children were raised communally, rather than primarily with their biological parents. But this effectively meant as children were raised in groups of same-aged peers. It's as if you were being raised around the people in your first grade classroom. Same-aged children were being put together and raised together. And they would start doing this very shortly after birth. They would spend more time with these peer groups than their biological families. And the real fascinating information that fell out of these communities is that children who were reared together in these peer groups did not subsequently engage in sexual behavior or marry each other. That is, of the 3,000 marriages they had documented in one of these kibbutz, almost none of those 3,000 marriages were marriages between people that had been raised in the same peer group as children. And there were also no documented cases of sexual behavior between these children that were raised in the same peer group. There were a couple rare exceptions that were found to this rule, and those were universally found in children that had been introduced to the peer group after about the age of 6. And this is really a remarkable finding because one of the best predictors for thinking about who ends up marrying with, mating with who, tends to be proximity. That is, who's around you. Who you're closest with physically is often pretty good at predicting who you're most likely to mate with. Because it would really be strange to find that, like, everyone who went to the same college, out of everyone who went to the same college, imagine you found that none of them ended up marrying each other or having sex with each other. That would be bizarre. But that's basically exactly what we're seeing here. Children who grew up around each other from a very young age did not marry each other and did not engage in sexual behavior with each other. And the reason this is likely the case is because ancestrally, for most of our evolutionary past, it's much more likely that the people we're being raised around were close genetic relatives, your immediate family. The people you're raised around thus potentially pose an inbreeding risk. And our learning mechanisms picked up on this regularity of the environment, and we behave as if that's true. And yet in a modern context, like let's say this kibbutz here, where it's no longer true, our brains still behave as if it is. Remember, we're just adaptation executioners. We use the mental tools we have, even if modern environments have changed, and those tools aren't acting adaptively anymore. This is all about the past. What used to be true rather than what is true. And by the way, sometimes the reverse also happens. I don't have any good research that speaks to this on hand right now, or how often it happens, but it really doesn't take a lot of searching online to find stories of siblings that met each other later in life because they were separated at birth, adopted out to different families. and they're unaware that they're genetically related, and they end up forming romantic and sexual bonds with each other. Occasional outcomes like this are to be expected if they're missing some critical developmental cues when they're younger, because this learning mechanism might require information that it just never received. And if it didn't receive that information early, it fails to form this connection to the same degree that this person is my close genetic relation, I should avoid mating with them. So it seems that the frequency of being around other people, the frequency of proximity with others during early childhood, is at least one of the cues that our brain is using to estimate our degree of kinship that we share with others. It's probably not the only cue, but it seems to be a pretty important one. Further, like our learning language mechanisms, our language learning adaptations, this incest avoidance learning mechanism might not remain active our entire lives, because as you get older, the amount of time you spend around people becomes a worse cue for their genetic relatedness to you, and so we don't use that anymore because it's no longer useful. The learning mechanism appears to have a critical developmental window, after which that information stops having the value it used to, and that, from what we've seen in this study, seems to be about 6 years old. So worth repeating, as always, is that these learning mechanisms in every case we've discussed today are context-specific. A general-purpose learning mechanism would have a difficult time trying to learn who your relatives are if it didn't know what cues to look for. And in fact, this general-purpose learning mechanism would probably have a difficult time even knowing that learning who your genetic related individuals are is something it should learn at all. Why would it pay attention to this if it didn't know to pay attention to this? Out of all the infinite things it could learn, why am I learning this thing and not others? And if you have a general purpose learning mechanism that operates like it does in a Skinner box, well, this would have no chance whatsoever at learning any connection between incestuous relationships and the later consequences of inbreeding depression. How would a general purpose learning mechanism know that because I had sex with this person several months ago, and this person is my close genetic relation, that now the infant which is born is suffering some poor outcomes because of our close relatedness? A general purpose learning mechanism would be completely hopeless at learning this task. We need to come prepared with mechanisms that hone in on these specific aspects of the environment and behave as if they have this information. So there's really a lot more to learning here than just raw associations with rewards and punishments. Learning is not this passive, all-purpose glue of an explanation for everything that humans and other species do. Learning is something that has to be explained, both in terms of why and how it happens the way it does. It's not going to be enough for us to just say, oh, this kid learned to be violent because he grew up in a violent culture, and then call it a day. That doesn't work. We need to dig a lot deeper than that. As we have seen here, in order for learning to be useful in the first place, organisms need to know what to learn, and they need to know how to learn it. And this is because the problems we need to learn about are relatively few in number compared to the infinite number of things we might learn. And the task of learning them is going to vary greatly from one context to the other. We need different information to learn to avoid food, or incestuous relationships, or fear. These cues are very different, and the rules about how we learn them are very different. Sometimes it's immediate. I behave one way now and I get punished immediately. Sometimes it's delayed. I ate food and several hours later I get sick. Sometimes it's really delayed. I had sex with a close genetic relation, and now several months later we have produced a non-viable offspring. Now, none of this is to say that we can't learn things we haven't directly adapted to learn. We can and we do all the time. So we can learn things like how to use a computer or how to drive a car, even though computers and cars were not part of our recurrent ancestral environments as a species. However, when we are learning these novel tasks, our success is often going to depend pretty highly on the correspondence between the features of what we're learning now and the features of what we were adapted to learn. Because we're going to be using the mechanisms of the things we were adapted to learn on the novel tasks. If we return to our kitchen example from several lectures ago, if you have a pocket knife, you can use a pocket knife to prepare food in the kitchen or to eat dinner. It's not going to be the most efficient way to get the job done, but you can use a tool intended for one task for a different task. And so if you're trying to learn about something in the modern world, you're going to be using learning mechanisms that evolved to learn other things that used to exist. And if the modern thing resembles those old things, it'll work pretty well. And if the modern thing doesn't resemble those old things, it'll work pretty poorly. And there's one last note I wanted to make on this whole incest avoidance learning for now, which is that there are, as we have seen, many ways our mind is going to learn who our relatives are. We have cognitive modules for kinship estimation, as do many other species. And this information, who is related to you, how closely are they related to you, is not solely going to be used for the realm of learning who to avoid sexual contact with. That is, you can take this information once you have it, who's your close genetic relatedness in your area, who's closely genetically related to you, and use it to govern other behaviors. And that's going to start to get into next time.